welcome to chapter 3, Blessed to be a Blessing. Something to note here is that this lesson is 2 hours long. So think ahead this week. Can you extend the time that you're meeting up with them a little bit? Or do you need to break this up into 2 different halves? Luckily, if you do decide to split this up, it lends itself to that pretty perfectly, because one half is going to be about Moses, one half is going to be about Abraham, so you can easily cover one in each week. So I would typically start this lesson again, as usual, by talking about the homework. How did it go? What questions popped up from from the reading this past week? Questions are really, really good, guys. It means they're actually reading, they're actually thinking through and comprehending the content. So don't be afraid of the questions. As always, if you need resources, head to anyfocus.org/FOJ for a list of resources to help you with each reading. The Bible Project has a really, really good Q&R over Exodus verses 1 to 18 that's worth really checking out. Even if they don't have any questions, I would check that out anyway, honestly. And Focus also recently did a pizza theology over the book of Exodus. Use these opportunities when students ask you really good questions to expand your own understanding. Remember, leaders are readers. Great leaders use their resources well to learn, grow, so take advantage of our suggestions. And if they haven't read, I would ask why not? The reading for this week should probably take about an hour and a half, or about the amount of time people spend scrolling through things on their phones every day. This really isn't too much to ask. This is actually a pretty low benchmark. So again, ask questions. What's the deal? How can we help them succeed this week? So back to our content. The main goal of this chapter is to talk about faith and about blessing others. The first half with Abraham gives you an opportunity to unpack what does it mean to have faith, and the second half with Moses gives you an opportunity to talk about blessing others. So jumping in, we have this awesome quote from a book called The Drama of Scripture, which I highly recommend, by the way. This quote just sums up the process you guys are involved in right now studying FOJ. In order to be a missionary people, they have to be formed to be like the promise they carry. By reading these texts, we hope to be formed together to become more like Jesus together, so that we can become the kind of missionary people that we're called to be. It's good stuff. And we have a reflection question from the pre-work. So if you haven't already, use this chance to reflect together. Then read the text below aloud. It gives a bit more context on what we're about to read. Now the first section is over Genesis 12. Some things to point out here. First, if they're unfamiliar, Abram and Abraham are the same dude. Spoiler alert. God changes Abram's name to Abraham in Genesis 17. You won't be reading that passage today, so just kind of keep that in mind. And this is a huge narrative-defining promise from God in these first few verses. In verses 1 to 3, the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, your father's household to this land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I'm going to bless you. I will make your name great. You will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. Whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So you're kind of getting where we got this idea of blessed to be a blessing from. But these few verses are a huge deal for this story and for the whole biblical story together. That all peoples on earth are going to be blessed through this line. We see in this chapter God protecting Abraham and his family. We see Abraham acting in faith. He leaves everything that he knows, everything he's ever known, his family, and he follows God. That's a really good thing. And then right away, just to back that up, we also see Abraham acting rather faithlessly. Not only does he act cowardly and he gives his wife away, but this act shows that he doesn't really trust God. Remember, God's promise to Abraham is that he's going to produce offspring, right? You can't really have offspring if you abandon your wife and let her go and be a part of this Pharaoh's household. Right? So Abraham's showing he doesn't trust God. If he trusted God, he would say, hey, God will actually take care of me through this whole thing. I don't need to sell her off. But we see instead he abandons her, he looks to his own interests and kind of seeks to save his own skin instead. In this section, I also like to take a moment and reflect on faith. We've got this question, what does it mean to have faith? But you may even want to take a step back and say, just what is faith? How would you define it personally? I think the way that the Bible presents faith, faith is an active thing. It's not simply belief. Belief is just kind of a passive thing. I believe this, I believe that. I may believe recycling is good, but if it doesn't really change the way I live my life, if it doesn't really impact the way that I purchase things, the way that I throw away things, if I'm not really a faithful participant in changing this world, then maybe I don't really have faith in recycling. Maybe I don't really wholeheartedly do this, practice it. Believing correct things doesn't change anything. Neither does really having a great theology. Knowing all the correct things doesn't mean I really have faith in something. At least that's the way the Bible presents these things. Remember James 2, and you guys are actually going to get to this passage later in this section. In James 2:18, he says, "But some will say, you have faith and I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by my deeds. You believe that there is one God? Good. Even the demons believe that and shudder." Right? He's pointing out this kind of absurd idea that demons have probably pretty good theology. They know who God is, they understand his role, what he's doing, but that doesn't save them. That doesn't mean that they have faith in God. That's a ridiculous idea, right? Demons don't have faith in God, but they know the right things. And likewise for us, especially here in this Bible Belt area, we have lots of students who know the right things about God, but they are very far from following him faithfully. That's kind of what I like to point out in this faith section. So another thing I'd like to say about faith is that biblical faith always occurs within the context of relationships, right? Just like in real life, our faith, our belief in people always occurs within relationships because of a relational bond, because of a trust that's been built. Think about your parents or whoever looked after you growing up. You have a relationship with them because they were always there, because they were constant, because they kept their promises, because they always had food for you, they always had a bed for you to sleep in, right? And that's where I think biblical faith comes from. It's trust in this God that throughout history has acted in similar ways again and again and again. And that's why we can believe in God. That's why we can trust him, because we have this book full of these promises made and fulfilled. And then as we start trusting him and following him in our kind of day-to-day lives, we start seeing that he is faithful in our own lives as well. I also like to point that out. So on to Genesis 15 and 16. God makes a whole bunch of promises. God is Abraham's shield, his reward. He says, look up to the sky, count the stars, if indeed you can count them. And he said to him, and so shall your offspring be. So this very famous passage, and he tells them about that they're going to inherit the land. But then we also see a lot more acts of faithlessness. God makes a promise that he will give Abraham and Sarah offspring. So they decide to go ahead and, well, that's cool, God, thanks. We'll go ahead and make this happen ourselves. And there's a few reflection questions here for us to process. The main goal really in this section is to get to the personal questions. In what areas do you have a hard time trusting God in? How do you think God reacts when you fail? And remember in these to also share personally here from your own life. Next, we're going to read James, which ties this whole faith conversation together. What role do deeds play in having faith? Well, they're inseparable, to answer it very simply. But I think it's helpful to process this, think through this, maybe even rope in a few other passages that talk about this idea from the Bible. It's helpful to put in your own words how this whole thing works together. So think through it with them, process through it. And finally, ask, are you dead or alive in your faith? This is a critical moment in some studies. It's the first time that some people may have had to come to terms with what following Jesus is all about. So don't shy away from it. Just ask and follow up. Use follow-up questions if need be. The following passages from Ephesians and 1 Corinthians are just to be read aloud, but note how they connect to everything. And now we're on to Moses. So first things first, we watch a Bible Project video on Exodus 19 to 40. This will help connect the dots of where we're at in the story now, because we're reading Exodus 34. But it's also going to help fill in some gaps in this overall big story of God that we're following. So feel free to ask what stuck out from the video, or see if they have any questions, or anything that they missed in there. Then on to Exodus 34. We learn some things about God here. We get this awesome passage, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and the fourth generation. So we get that. We get a picture of just how gracious God is, how loving he is. Following that passage, we see one of the important things here is that Moses' face is shining after he meets God. And one of the important things to point out here is just how holy God is. Right? He's so holy that being in his presence changes you and even makes you kind of scary to average, everyday, normal people. It transforms you. It makes you kind of scary. And another kind of foreshadowing thing, to think about this passage is what happens later on that you'll be reading about in Mark is the transfiguration, when Jesus comes and he's shining and he also goes up onto a mountaintop. So be looking for those parallels later on in the story. But you can even ask in this whole passage in what ways these descriptions match what they believe about God. And then we'll turn on to 1 Peter after you've asked all the questions. So how does this connect? Like all of these, there are a lot of things we could say. A lot of big images are being thrown around here, there, everywhere. But maybe the coolest part about all of this is that this promise that was once for Israel is now being applied in the New Testament to everyone, right? And that means that we get to be a part of it. That's the good news here. So all of us are part of this royal priesthood. The thing that was once for this select few is now for all Christians everywhere. The promise that began with Abraham has become full circle. God has blessed all people through the line. He didn't just do it by flesh and blood, offspring, but through adoption, right? And with the following questions after this, we want to make people process, what does that mean? If this is God's character revealed in Exodus, he's compassionate, he's gracious, he's slow to anger, he's abounding in love and faithfulness, that it also probably ought to be our character too, right? And I think we need to take this seriously and live differently and challenge one another to be more like this, to embody God's character attributes more. And in the following Making Connections section, we've got a few passages, so a little bit just so you kind of know what to get out of here. 2 Corinthians is getting at the practical challenge that we need to prioritize blessing others. Acts 10 is this beautiful passage about the whole story of God, no longer being for Jews, but for all peoples. And Revelation is the one that just hits this home, brings it back by giving us a glimpse of our future, right? A future where peoples from every nation, tribe, people, language are worshiping our God together. So good. As always, just reading through these is great, but if you have extra time, you can always ask them to point out the connections that they're seeing being made and help articulate why these were chosen. Finally, remind them about the pre-work, and see you guys in the next video. Thanks.